We hit the full hour, so I thought we would get started.
Okay,
This is like the movies, David, where somebody will clip and then we get going.
right.
So my name is Morten Elvang. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup, and it's a true pleasure to have David Anderson joining us from Bilbao. I attended all the classes I could find years back from your university, David, and you're still very much present in my mind. Just before we started, we were just talking how long time since we met, and it is a number of years, but I'm one of the persons who keep going back and finding inspiration in your ideas. So you are
Thank you.
close. And super to have you here today. So what we just agreed to do is that we will do this conversation based. So David and I will have a talk about strategy, what's going on, any advice for people who are new to it based on what David knows. And then after about 30 minutes or when the time is right, we will open it up for wider conversation. Is that okay, David?
Sure, yeah. I see a few other faces that I recognize. Hi, Dennis.
Yeah,
Hi,
exactly. And
Peter.
let's keep this casual. It's just good to have an idea of the
Yeah,
structure, then you can break it later.
very good. Okay.
Anything you want us to know before we get going, David?
I have no idea really, so I think you can kick off the conversation.
Yeah, very well. So I think the first question would really be uh, what's your take on the idea of strategy as part of the work we do? I mean, how do you see that concept? Has anything recently been changing to how it's evolving, and even how is it part of your wider body of work?
Yeah, so for 10 plus years, I've been talking about and teaching from time to time a concept called enterprise services planning. And part of that material became the Fit for Purpose book that Alexis Zhegloff and I wrote in 2017. It's now in the third edition, so it's had some updates. And the timing of that work first emerged in 2014, and it largely came about from really a simple but profound question that people were asking in class. How would you anticipate that a change you're going to make would be an improvement? Because we'd rather not make changes if they're not going to improve things. And that had a significant impact on the way we communicated improvements, because the answer, of course, lies in evolutionary biology that if a change is an improvement, it will be fitter for the environment. If you take a species and somehow alter it, mutate it in some way, it will survive and thrive if it's fitter for the environment. It's a little bit of an oversimplification because it depends what's going on in the environment. If it's a nice steady equilibrium and you've got one mutation, one individual, the rest of the pack, the flock, the herd will just kill it. They will eliminate it from the gene pool. So you don't want to take the analogy too far, but the idea that evolution has built into it a mechanism for selecting things that are improvements. So instead of talking about continuous improvement, which had this huge problem with Western executives that as soon as you talk about it, or some Japanese word like kaizen, and they also, you know, we have some idiot consultant who's been reading Japanese books and believes in, you know, Buddhism and the seventh heaven and things like this. It just turned them off. And I realized that the pragmatic thing that they would listen to was, yes, you've got a problem. We need to make some improvement until the problem goes away. And when fix that problem, then the number two problem gets promoted. So the concept of talking about the fitness of your business, whether it's the process or the product or the service that you've got, and that you improve that to reach some threshold where it's now sufficiently good that the customers are happy. That worked a lot better. And that sort of coincided with, in 2012, Michael Porter's company went bust. Right? So Michael Porter, the sort of 20th century guru of strategy, and his business failed. And Steve Denning wrote an article about that failure where he summarized it as traditionally businesses were focused on their competitors, this traditional approach to strategy. And I remember sitting in meetings like that when I worked at Sprint, which is a big phone company in the United States. And I worked there between 2000 and 2002. And I had this sort of good piece of luck that my boss's boss was the chief marketing officer. So officially, I was part of the marketing business unit, and I was very close to a lot of senior executives, and I got to sit in quite a lot of very senior meetings at the company. I knew the head of strategic planning pretty well, a guy called Bill Blessing. And I'd often find myself in meetings where people were quoting their Michael Porter business school education and talking about the company's position relative to our competitors in the mobile phone business in the United States. So I was very familiar with all of this, focused on the competitors. And the replacement approach for that was don't focus on your competitors, focus on your customers. And Steve Denning made this observation that Porter hadn't been focused enough on his customers, and he didn't have a business that was capable of evolving, adapting, and changing to a new environment where large companies that were doing well were the ones who were acutely focused on their customers. Well, I had this emerging idea that became known as the fit for purpose framework, that you understand who the customer is, you understand why they're doing business with you, and based on that, you determine the criteria that they would use for selecting your product or service in comparison to someone else's. And what makes your product good enough fit for their purpose, and potentially what makes them select you over other potentially probably quite good solutions. And it turns out that the selection criteria that customers use, they're looking at 3-4 options. It could be in a store and they're on the shelf, or it might be that they've driven down to the local strip of car dealerships and they're working their way along on a Saturday afternoon thinking about buying a new car. Well, the criteria they're going to use to choose one over another is maybe only one or two things. And if you wrote this long feature list for the product, it could have 400 or 500 features, and 2 of them really matter. There could be just 1 or 2 where the customer says, yes, I love that, I'm going to buy this. And therefore, before we get back to strategy, there's this concept of strategic capability. And the strategic capability that's required in this century is this ability to have very deep empathy with your customers, to be able to ruthlessly segment the market into lots, to understand that a customer comes to you with some purpose, some solution they're looking for, some problem they want solved. And to understand that, and if you can do that, then you can focus your whole organization on how do we deliver that. Now, there is a very big business that I admire a lot and I use a lot in my training that's very good at this already. They're certainly not the only one, but Richard Branson's Virgin Group exhibits most of the things that I find myself teaching in the enterprise services planning material. That the company's now led, at least the public face of the company is Richard's daughter, Holly Branson. Her job title's Chief Purpose Officer. And even today, I saw Richard on social media talking about leading with purpose. So it's the idea that the business needs to have a purpose, and then understanding the customer's purpose and what they're looking for. And Virgin have a fairly simple strategy to who their business is and why they exist. Generally speaking, they enter existing businesses where all the incumbent players are doing it badly. So imagine that you surveyed all the customers in a market, and the market research said, I hate my current supplier. Mm-hmm. And I used to sit in marketing all hands meetings at Sprint, 750 people in marketing. We had to rent a cinema to do these all hands meetings every quarter. And there was a vice president there who reported up to my boss's boss. I forget his job title, vice president of marketing something. And his job was to get on stage and report the customer research. And every quarter he would get up and present a bunch of data. And he'd end it with, so in summary, our customers think that we suck. But the good news is that they think that we suck less than our competitors. Now, that's a perfect market for the Virgin Group to enter, which is exactly what they did. The Virgin Mobile that had started in Europe was moving to the US, and they approached us and said, hey, we want to rent capacity on your network, white label your entire service and stick a Virgin brand on it. And then they wanted to add 2 or 3 other features to the network. And by some strange coincidence, I and my team got in the middle of this deal because quite a lot of it was about the internet offering that they would make. At the time, the whole idea of putting the internet on a mobile phone was new. Mm-hmm. So when Virgin approached and said, hey, and we want to do internet services, they looked around the phone company with, who the hell knows anything about the internet? Oh, Anderson and his team, they know. Right. So we got pulled into that deal. So I was very intimate with all the terms and conditions of the Virgin deal. And Virgin basically came in and said, look, we want to sell these plans to teenagers, and teenagers need SMS text messaging. And that was a feature that we didn't have. So they bought an SMS gateway and they installed it in our network. So Virgin had this very intense understanding, this customer empathy, that they knew exactly what this market niche was going to want and need, and that all the other players in the market were not doing it properly. And therefore they could enter the market, in this case, relatively cheaply by renting the capacity as a mobile virtual network operator and launching a better service than anyone else. Now, recently, they started a new brand called Virgin Hotels. And in the run up to Virgin Hotels, pretty much every day, or at least every week for 2 years, Richard was on social media saying, hey, do you travel for business? Stay in hotels while you're away on those business trips? Tell us what you like, what you don't like. And they collected lots of customer information that included all the reasons that people were dissatisfied with their business trip hotels. And then they designed a concept for Virgin Hotels that fixed those problems. And they enter the market offering better product with better service because they have better customer empathy. So in 2014, I started promoting the idea that you needed this ruthless market segmentation, and you needed deep customer empathy with each customer in the segment, and that your core strategic capability was, first of all, to do that, and then secondly, not to get complacent by continually monitoring, sensing the market. Is the customer's opinion changing? Are their expectations changing? And recognizing that you need to be able to evolve and adapt as the market moves around you. And if you can do those basically two things, this ruthless segmentation with the deep customer empathy, and build a capability to adapt to your organization, then you will survive and thrive long into the future.
Thank you. I could not help it but think that Richard and Holly are on their way into the agile business.
I'm not aware of anything specific, but my observation is that they largely get into very physical businesses, and they're things that ordinary people can use every day. Obviously not Virgin Galactic, right? That's the odd one out.
Where I wanted to take you, just couldn't help it. Let's come back to the concept of strategy a bit. So for you, what exactly is that thing we call strategy?
So I came to this understanding by observing bad decision making. And sometimes it's my own company. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's, I should know better, and I should have not made that mistake 8 years ago. And stuff that I teach, and you've been in my change leadership class, stuff that I teach in that class, that someone's identity strongly controls their decision making, and often in a way that they're not conscious of it. So the strategy needs to start with identity. It needs to start with who you are. Because even if you a bunch of gurus with different books, like start with why. Yes, why is important. And the Virgin Group lead with purpose, right? So you need a purpose, and you can get people aligned behind that purpose. But if you don't have a strong sense of your identity, then there will be times where you make decisions that are not well aligned with the purpose, and you haven't even noticed that you've done it. So understanding the identity of your business and recognizing where that might limit you. Now, we had a keynote speaker at our Indian conference years ago, and he was talking about this. And he was talking about it more from an individual perspective, but he said that resilience comes from having a broad sense of your identity. So companies that have a very narrow sense of their identity are a lot more fragile, and their decision making is often very constrained by this narrow sense of their identity. So to use my own company as an example, if our identity is the Kanban company, that's very limiting. But if our identity is that we're a management training business, that's very broad. Right? So there's a lot more resilience in being a management training business than there is in being the Kanban company. It's very narrow.
Good example.
So leaders need to be aware, and they need to be sort of proactively conscious of what's the identity of our business. And at one point in my career, I worked at Microsoft for a while during the Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates was still there. Then I worked for Bill at another company that he owns. I've met Bill. I've seen Bill and Steve on stage at small company events inside the campus quite a few times. And it was clear to me that both of them really understood the identity of the company in a way that most other people don't. And the current leader, Satya Nadella, also does. Microsoft is a developer tools and platform company. Right? And when Ballmer would run around the stage at the company meeting screaming, developers, 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 developers. I'm sure you've all seen the video. That was because we win the hearts and minds of the developers with the best, easiest to use developer tools. They select our platform, they build their applications and solutions using our tools, and the whole world has to use Microsoft's platform. So they win in the market by winning the hearts and minds of developers. And if we look at deals that Satya Nadella did, like buying Mojang, their assumption was these 8-year-old kids who were sitting in cinemas in Seattle, 400 of them at a time, playing Minecraft together on the big screen, they were the next generation of developers. You win the hearts and minds of these 8-year-old Minecraft players, and you win the next generation of the development platform war. So Microsoft's identity fundamentally is it's a developer tools and platform company, and that has not changed. And Bill understood it, Steve understood it, Satya Nadella understands it. And once you recognize that for what it is, you see the congruence of their decision making, or from time to time, maybe the incongruence. So you start with who, then you need a why. And so if I look at my own business, we're a management training company, and why are we here? Well, a couple of years ago, a good friend of mine called Barry Bain passed away. And Barry became a friend of mine because I used a quote from his 1981 book in my 2003 book. My publisher sent it to him. He read it. He wrote me an email and said, hey, you need to come present this stuff at USC. So that quote was that it's from Software Engineering Economics. The quote was that software costs, they rise faster than what influences the cost to rise faster than anything else is poor management. And that research was done in the 1970s. And the original paper was published in the 70s, the book in 1981. And here we are 40 plus years later, and we're not really any further ahead. That professional services, intangible goods, knowledge worker businesses are very poorly managed. And fundamentally, I think the reason for that is that the work is invisible. It's intangible, where in a physical environment, physical things engage all of our senses, and therefore our whole brain is switched on processing them. And it causes just common sense to kick in. It also highlights, stupidity is prevented. We have a case study from Blizzard Sport, who makes skis, and their former CIO is a guy called Eric Jan Kak, who's now at Spar, the supermarket chain. And Eric gave me a tour of the facility at Blizzard, probably 2013. And we're in the warehouse, and he was talking about the bad old days when things weren't going so well at Blizzard, and the mess the inventory was in, and the demand to increase production. They needed more inventory. We had nowhere to store it. And he opened the door at the back, and there was a field outside with cows in it. And he said, so we were going to purchase this field from the farmer and build another warehouse. But the bank wouldn't lend them the money. Right. So it prevented them from making a mistake, which was to increase the inventory. And instead, they had to focus on some other much more lean type of solution. And eventually, that led them over a 2 to 3 year period to completely transform the way they made skis and to become the most efficient ski manufacturer in the world. So physical environments will cause people to use their common sense, but in an intangible goods environment, it seems that everything's invisible. We do a lot of stupid things. So the purpose of my business is to fix that problem. Right? So we're a management training company, and our mission is to improve the quality of management in intangible goods, professional services, businesses. And then there's an interesting little target. It's called the Drucker Challenge. So Peter Drucker passed away in 2005, but in 1999, he wrote a paper where he said, look, over the last 100 years, manufacturing industry has improved by 200 times. And therefore, my challenge to knowledge worker industries is to improve over the next century by at least 50 times. And so we're a quarter of the way into that now. How much progress have we really made? Right. So, and yet we know from data that people following the work that I've published over these last 23 years or so, some of these companies are doing dramatically better. That some of them have increased the productivity by 4 times, 8 times. One group from Accenture in Rio de Janeiro published data showing a 16 times improvement. And the delivery times shrink from, say, 100 days to 10 days, 90% or more down. Well, those kind of gains, just that gets you halfway to Drucker's target. So the someone in the group helped me out with a science fiction writer who said that the future's already arrived. It's just not equally distributed.
I heard that, but I don't remember who said it. Maybe somebody.
Neil Gaiman, maybe. If not, someone will tell me. And therefore, what we observe around the world is that the future's already arrived at some companies, but it's not very equally distributed. Right. So you have your who and then your why, and then the next is the what, right? What are the products and services that you're going to deliver in order to enable the purpose, the why? And that's your portfolio. And then there's the how you do it, right? The processes. So
maybe I could ask you a question.
The summary there was that it's the who, then the why, then the what, then the how. And any one of those 4 things can be adapting and evolving and changing
exactly
in response to what's going on in the environment around you.
Yeah.
And that's it, really, right? That's the whole approach to strategy is you need to know who you are, why you're here, what you're offering to deliver on the why, how you're doing that in order for it to be fit enough, fit for purpose. And the other side of it is to know who you're serving, this ruthless market segmentation and this deep customer empathy and this understanding of the fitness criteria that customers in those segments are holding. You do all of that really well with the ability to sense the outside world and make adaptations and to adapt, whether it's the how, the way you're doing something, or the what. Most of the time it will be those 2. Occasionally it'll be the why. From time to time you need to say, is our purpose still relevant? Now, I happen to think the purpose for my own business is relevant for the remainder of my natural life. I honestly do not think we're going to have completely solved this management of intangible goods industries problem before I die. So I don't anticipate a very big change in the why. And then there's the who. Depending on how you've defined the who, you may or may not need to change it. If you're IBM and you're the mainframe company, eventually there was a point where that had to change. And Lou Gerstner had to arrive and change that into the professional services company. And then there's a point where they don't make mainframes anymore. And there's a point where perhaps the services company isn't the future for them anymore. They take a whole bunch of that, to, separate it out, this crindrill, and then they go looking for a new identity for IBM. And the companies will need to do that from time to time. Using IBM as the example over their 100+ year history, then it's a cadence of about once every 40 years. Is that accelerating? Maybe.
This is beautiful. Thank you. So would it, and I might be biased by my own thoughts on this one, but it sounds to me like you see strategy very much as an approach that can even change where you are. So if I hear you, strategy is formed by your identity. And sometimes you even need to go back and change that identity as part of the process of making strategy.
There is an unspoken assumption in all of this, and that assumption is that you are leading a business that you wish to survive, that you want it to continue. And if it's a 100-year-old tech company like IBM, maybe you want it to continue for another 100 years. If you were taking a much shorter term view for whatever reason, then you might think differently, right? The whole idea of having a business that is built for survival, the term that I've been using for a few years now, when I realized if I used built to last, people assumed that it was built out of the Porras and Collins book from 1996. But interestingly, in Built to Last, they do talk about the concept of businesses that are wired with evolutionary DNA. And specifically, they talk about 3M, which they refer to as the Minnesota mutation machine. But the interesting thing about 3M is that their business units tend to be sort of 150 to 300 people. And the revenues of the individual business units are what you might expect with, say, a 300-400 person company. The observation that I've made in a number of recent being the last 10 years presentations is none of us fly in 3M planes. We don't get our electricity from 3M power stations. So the 3M doesn't do things at the scale of a IBM or a General Electric or an Airbus, something of that nature. And therefore, is there a company that has that sort of evolutionary DNA wired into it that does operate at these huge scales? And I don't have a good example of that. The Virgin Group's a very big company, but it survives with this very broad sense of its identity, which enables them to have this very diverse portfolio of businesses. Because the Virgin Group's identity is more related to their purpose. And the idea that they improve customer service in businesses that people need and use every day. So if they think that people hate their gym, then they open a chain of fitness centers and they try to do it better than everyone else. If they think that people hate their personal computer, and in the 1990s they did do this, you were able to buy Virgin PCs, at least in the United Kingdom in the 1990s.
It sounds a little bit like the famous GE strategy, which was to be number one or number two in any business they were in.
That's a Hewlett-Packard strategy.
Okay, I also heard it for GE.
To be number one or number two in any business that they're in or exit it, which is the argument that Carly Fiorino made for the acquisition of, not Dell.
Digital. I'm not sure. I forgot it. Someone online would know.
It's interesting how a company gets acquired, the brand disappears. 30 years later, you've forgotten what it was. So Carly's argument was, we're number 3 in the PC business. We need to make this acquisition so that we'll be number 1 or 2. And that became a huge distraction. Compaq is the name we're looking for, right? So we have to acquire Compaq, and the combined Compaq HP business will be number 1 in PCs. So her leadership strategy was, let's annex a small neighboring country so that we've got a bigger country with greater scale and more power, rather than focus on improving the customer experience. Meanwhile, in the same time frame, 2005, 2006, there were a couple of middle managers at the printer, the laser printer division, who were implementing essentially Kanban, stuff they'd seen me present at a conference in Chicago, and they'd flown home to Boise, Idaho, and started to investigate what was going on in their space. Well, they cut the time for the next generation of printers from 4.5 years to 5 months, and then they brought it down to only 3 months. So imagine what that does. It's your core cash cow business making laser printers. And instead, the previous generation had taken them 2 years, and their forecast for the next generation of the platform was 4.5 years. Instead, they cut that to 5 months. What does that do to a business? And there's a guy who's well known in the Agile space, Robert Benefield. He was inside the HP laser printer division at that time. So I've heard the story from his point of view. Like, all of a sudden, they could make new laser printer designs faster than the rest of the business was capable of distributing, selling them, coping with the maintenance and support and so on.
Beautiful.
Right.
I actually have a similar story from the old Nokia.
No, go on.
Well, back in the days, it was like we had something we called hang and integration time, and they were really like 9 months and 6 months when the whole thing started. And over 3 to 4 years, it came down to less than a day, and the company could stop hiring for a while. So it was really like a dramatic consequence. David, thank you so much. I thought we should.
On that point, though, when I worked at Sprint, we the 2 market leaders in mobile phones were Nokia and Motorola. We did not buy handsets from either of them. And the reason was that we designed all our own handsets because we wanted control of the customer experience. The lead times from Nokia and Motorola were 18 months to 2 years. And if we used LG and Samsung, the Korean manufacturers, it was 9 months. From the point where we had a prototype and a design, a specification, to having the phones on the shelf in a retail store was 9 months. And that made a difference, huge difference, if your strategic position was to be the market leader and the innovator, to be the fastest to market with the newest stuff. So sometimes these capabilities matter, right? Capability can be core to strategy. All right, go on. Questions?
Thank you. I got sucked into your story. Really appreciate. We also wanted to open it up a bit for people. So let's try to do a little bit of table tennis with questions and answers, if that's okay for you, David.
Go for it.
Let's open it up.
Don't be shy.
I'll not be shy for once.
Please, Tom.
So David, your remark on software being a problem because of its intangibility is correct for those who do not know how to quantify the essential characteristics of software. But some people know, and it's called engineering, and it's called software metrics. And I put something in the chat about that. What do you say? Is it, if you can quantify all the cost and quality characteristics of software, is it so intangible?
I think software engineering still needs to be managed. The fact that perhaps you've got a lot more information, of course, I am a software engineer, Tom, and for me, the last 25 years was like, it was like we're in reverse gear as an industry. So it's like engineering got abandoned. Now, as a general observation, more mature businesses can do software engineering, and more mature businesses are better managed. So is it a causation or just a correlation? Right. My programming career, I spent probably half of it or even more in the games industry, like a cottage industry, kids in their back bedrooms programming assembly language and making enough money to when I was still in high school, I was earning 5 times more than my father. So that was programming. And we would produce tens of thousands of lines of code, not a single piece of documentation in it, and not a single bug in it either. And totally unusable, everything in our head. Right? You want to reuse the code from the last game, well, it's in the head, just reproduce it. And then after graduating university, I really became a software engineer, and I worked on bigger scale stuff in bigger mature businesses. And whatever people say, Microsoft's a fairly mature software development business. IBM was much more so, slower moving, of course, and a bit more conservative perhaps. But and in that period after I graduated university, I only worked for really good managers in really pretty mature environments. So it's been a constant education for me since I stopped doing that to have this exposure to this global IT industry, people who follow my work, and discover that so many of them work in utter chaos environments, just really low maturity environments. And it's every time I think that I've found the bottom, because if you followed my work for 15 years or more, you see we've gradually been moving down. The assumption that you might have some leader in your organization who can do stuff and take action. No, so let's gradually move down the stack. So yeah, software engineering correlates with high maturity organizations that correlate with good managers. It's a fair point.
Thank you. Any more questions?
David, one of the things you talked about was investigating changes in any of the why, how, what, being open and analyzing them. That doesn't happen in very many organizations very well in reality. What do you and it's necessary, but what do you see going on that's going to enable that to happen even as the markets move faster on our ability to execute changes?
I think companies do have strategy reviews. Now, in some cases, it's a cloister of half a dozen senior executives who fly away on a private jet to some location in the mountains for a few days, and then they come back, like coming down from the mountain with the tablets, right? Written with the new strategy written in stone. That's not going to cut it, really. But the idea that companies have strategy reviews, and even if they only do it annually, they're still doing it, they have to be asking themselves, why are we here? And is that still relevant? And who are we? And is that still relevant? And for how long? That then there is a requirement for some brutal honesty. I think that requires mature senior leadership. And it's quite difficult to look at yourself in the mirror and say, am I still relevant? And we're talking about the corporate equivalent of that. So they have the right forum for it, the strategy review. They're almost certainly doing it on some regular cadence. They just need to make sure they're asking the right questions on the agenda, and that they have the strength of character to be honest with themselves. And that, I think, is the thing that we see missing so much, right? That companies have a habit of kind of kidding themselves.
Yeah, one of the things I've been envisioning is making all those assumptions clear around the strategy and setting benchmarks to measure them. So when you come back together, it's not guessing or total intuition. It's, well, we thought these things would happen. They're not happening. And you can do it if you integrate the layers together, you can go up and down the stack. I think that ability to make it be really transparent would be powerful. I don't know that that's as actionable, maybe from a maturity.
I think at the how and the what level, it definitely is, right? That you can say, for example, we've got a target market segment. We're trying to sell mobile phones to teenagers, and we believe that teenagers want to send text messages to each other. And then a year later, you can observe, did they buy the product, and if they did buy it, did they use it? And if not, then what was wrong with our assumption? And in that particular case, well, all these European kids love to do it. What's wrong with Americans? And that's a different question to be answered. But if you were trying to set some criteria around how would we know whether our purpose is still relevant, I think that's a little harder and a bit more philosophical.
Yeah.
So, David, reflecting a bit on what we have been talking about, and actually not really knowing where you would take us in this, it sounds very much like you take the question of strategy back to something very fundamental. I mean, identity, purpose, relevance,
right? Because
is that how you think about it?
Exactly, right. That throughout the year in a business, many decisions get made by people in executive positions, and who we are as a business and why we're here affect those decisions. So you could have the smartest strategy, and then you spend time vexing over, why are people not doing stuff? Why do we not have alignment with action on the shop floor with our strategy? But the action on the shop floor is probably very aligned with who you are, your value system, the credo of the company, the purpose, why you're here. And that's what was out of sync. We've got a strategy that we've stuck up on the posters on the wall, but it's not congruent and aligned with our identity and our purpose.
So I also hear something else, which may or may not, well, of course, there is no conflict, but I think there's something else that you're emphasizing. You're emphasizing the need to constantly reevaluate yourself.
Yes.
The question of relevance
that is a core strategic capability, to be able to sense what's going in the outside world and sort of look at yourself in the mirror as a business and ask these tough questions that, are we still relevant? So with my own business over the last couple of years, there's been a number of things going on. The whole agile movement is basically over. There's no money in it anymore. The business model's dead. And AI has arrived. And what we've seen are people who were in the agile space before, they've all gone in different directions, pivot in different ways, some of them to strategy, for example. And I was at our leadership retreat in Lisbon, Cascais, actually, in Portugal, last summer, listening to people talking at lots of different sessions. And it's a 2.5 day event. So towards the afternoon of that last day, I was beginning to think about what the hell do I say to everyone in my closing remarks. And while there was a conversation going on, I forget what they were talking about. It occurred to me, okay, we are a management training business. Is that going out of fashion? Is it still relevant or not? Yes, it is. And why are we here? Because professional services businesses are poorly managed and have been for a long time. And it's a problem that Peter Drucker recognized, and we don't seem to have made a lot of progress on it in 70 years or so. So is that purpose still relevant? Yes, it is. And are LLMs and generative AI going to make those irrelevant? No, they are not. Right. So the conclusion I came to it was that our identity and our purpose are still relevant going forward. Maybe the how we do things and the what we offer might need to pivot, but the fundamentals of who we are and why we're here are still the same. So I was able to put together some closing remarks for the event that basically said, look, we are not being obviated by what's happening in the market. We need to remember who we are, why we're here, and what brought us to this point in the first place. In other words, reconnect with the roots of the business in order to figure out how to survive and thrive as we go forward. And no major pivot. Right? That I'm not trying to reinvent my Scrum training business as the product operating model business, as an example. Right? That we're going to stick to what we do because it's as relevant today as it has ever been.
Anyone with a final question? Well, then I opened a bit with this and really enjoy your storytelling around how you see the role of strategy in the context of your company and what you have experienced. I'm wondering a bit if you sort of put the ear to the grass and try to sort of be sensitive around just the topic and notion of strategy. Have you seen anything changing to that recently? I mean, has it gone up or down in importance? Is it more of a viable business proposition for yourself and your leadership training to focus more on that? I mean, any type of movement on the topic that might be.
Yeah, I think the challenge is always being viewed as an authority figure in some area. So while we might have very good strategic offerings, and at times I've done workshops with senior executives at very big companies, usually just the opportunities that fell from the sky. Some guy who, in one case, middle ranking executive at a big bank who'd read the Gene Kim novel, discovered Kanban, found my website, and then he ordered our basically identity and purpose workshop for 15, like including board members of this global bank. And it's hard to know how to turn that into a business. But there's a lot more that we could have talked about the detail of doing strategy. Like once you know who your target customer is and what will make the product or service fit for them, then we can start evaluating all the features on that list. Some of them will be table stakes. Some of them will be differentiating. Some of them will be features that a competitor already has, but they're not yet table stakes in the market. The catch-up, spoiler type features. Some will be there so that you can save money, cost reducers. And you can start evaluating what stage is the market at. There's an enthusiast market, an early adopter market, a mainstream market, a laggard market. the back end of the market wants low cost, so you need to drive the price down. So you need the cost reducing features. And if things are table stakes, should you buy them, rent them, or otherwise, or do you have to make it yourself? Well, if you're Ferrari, you still make your own engines, right? And the reason is that it's part of their identity, but they also view it as differentiating. And there will be times where there are things that you can buy as a commodity off the shelf, and that will save you a lot of money, but you have to recognize that all your competitors are going to have that same capability. And the automotive industry is struggling with this right now with electric cars, because electric motors are incredibly simple in comparison to internal combustion engines. Therefore, the engine, the motor, is no longer any sort of differentiator. And there's probably a reason that Ferrari haven't done a pure electric car. Ferrari's an engine manufacturer, handcrafted V12 engines with the guy who spends a whole week making your engine and then he signs it. Right? They don't want to put electric motors in Ferraris. But other manufacturers can no longer differentiate on the power or the performance of the motor. They have to find other ways. And recently we've seen Jaguar really struggling with that recognition. How do you make the Jaguar brand relevant in the 21st century as an electric car manufacturer when you can't differentiate on the motor?
You pimp it up. We already saw that.
So you can get into detail. And for 10 years, I've been teaching this class called Enterprise Services Planning that kind of pieces all these bits together. But what we've actually done in more recent years is taken bits out. One bit became the Fit for Purpose book, and other parts of it have appeared elsewhere. What we don't offer is a strategic planning class. Maybe I should, but at the moment, it's not something that's been in the portfolio. If I knew how to reach the right audience in sufficient volume, then it would make sense for sure.
Yeah. I think that's actually a brilliant observation. It's a pretty niche market. There's not that many people probably in the target group. David, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I wanted to end with just one question. Who are the people or things inspiring you at the moment? I mean, what are the new things that you are looking to? It doesn't even need to be professional. Just curious what makes you sort of do an extra spin.
I think that I feel like I've got a lot of backlog to work through, right? And I remain focused on these fundamental things. Right? But I'm trying to think the sort of stuff that I was reading relatively recently has all been related to scale and also evolution, right? So books like Sapiens and Scale, and just generally thinking about the problem of how do you scale something without losing the benefits that you achieve at small scale. I think fundamentally what companies saw with Agile was that at a team level we could go fast, but we couldn't scale that in anything better than a linear manner, or maybe even sublinear. So as we got bigger and bigger, we got slower and slower, and that's fundamentally what they're afraid of. So the things I've been reading, I've been really acutely focused on how do we understand how to scale something without sacrificing the benefit, and then how do you communicate that actually really works, which is a separate problem. If people don't believe in it, they aren't going to take action, and they're certainly not going to spend money with you. I got an email from a good friend in the US just a couple of days ago, and he said he'd been talking with a senior guy at an insurance company where I guess they fired all their Agile people a while ago. And he said, look, we've come to the conclusion that Agile requires a high level of trust. Yes, of course it does. And that you can't have that at scale, therefore you can't scale Agile. So we fired all these people and got. But unfortunately, that comes with this fundamental belief that you can't scale trust. And I don't believe that. Part of what we teach with the maturity model is how to scale trust. And political scientists teach it with relation to liberal democracies and large countries that are actually reasonably high trust environments. So it is possible to scale trust, but to find an executive team that believe they can never get there, I guess it's the same sort of mental block they have that you can't change the culture. Yes, you can. You just need to lead it from the top.
That's a beautiful way to land it.
Yeah, you can change culture, you can build more trust, but it requires the leadership from the top. And if the leadership doesn't believe, you're not going to make progress.
David, thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you a lot for taking time to join us. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to do something a little different.